Welcome to the Newsroom Pub. I'm Maryann Lazarski, the president of the Press Club and producer with Milwaukee PBS. Happy to be here today on this beautiful day. We're with Marquette Law School pollster Charles Franklin, who's been with us before, so we welcome him back. Got a lot of fans, that's good. He will present an analysis of his recent polling as well as the results of the April 2nd election and presidential primary. He's been the director of the Law School Poll since its inception in 2012, and since then the poll has been recognized as the definitive source for information about public opinion in Wisconsin. Before we get started, of course, I want to thank our event sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Spectrum News 1. Our supporting sponsor is We Energies. I'd also like to thank our event partner, WisPolitics.com. WisPolitics.com partners with the Press Club for this luncheon as part of its ongoing event series in Milwaukee, sponsored by UW-Milwaukee, Wisconsin Academy of Global Education and Training, 1125 at PAPS, the Medical College of Wisconsin, the Commercial Association of Realtors, and Spectrum. I'd also like to introduce our media panel today: Charles Benson from TMJ4 News, Jessie Opoien from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and Matt Smith from WISN TV. Are you ready? Okay, so without further ado, Charles Franklin.
Okay, good to be back. I've warned the panel that I'm going to be brief, which as an academic means keeping it under 45 minutes. But I'm going to endeavor to stick close to that. So I want to do a real quick overview and then let the event be driven by the questions. You know, I want to start with just sort of the national picture really quickly, because over the last month, the presidential race in national polling has tightened and is now essentially at a dead even split. The Real Clear Politics average this morning has Trump leading by 0.2 of 1 point. Over the entire last 18 months, the lead has never been greater than 4.5 points for either candidate. And most of the time it's been tighter than that. But since the mid-fall, Trump has generally led by between 2 and 4 points. So seeing that race tighten in recent weeks, I think, is an interesting point in the campaign. And we'll bear watching whether that tightens, well, it can't tighten much more, whether Biden actually takes a lead or whether it stays at this sort of minuscule lead for a while. I don't like overhyping the averages because they can move. Next week, maybe Trump will be up by 2. Maybe next week Biden will be up by 2. But I do think it's worth paying a little bit of attention to that. It certainly seems that in the last month there's been a modest movement in Biden's direction, which erased a small but meaningful 2 or 3 point Trump lead to now be what looks like a tie. If you go down the individual polls, I would say right now over the last 15 polls or so, probably more of them have Trump up by 1 or 2, but there are a fair number that have a tie or have Biden up by 1 or 2, and that's different from a month or 2 months ago when almost all the polls had Trump up by 1 or 2 or 3. So I do think there's a shift there, and it bears noticing. We know that it's a national race, but it's the Electoral College that makes the end decision. I meant that to be the end, E-N-D, decision. God help us if it makes the I-N decision next year. There, it's a little different and also bears watching. If we had exactly the same result in the states as we did in 2020, Biden would get 303 Electoral College votes. That's 6 down from what he got in 2020, entirely due to the redistribution of population and the reapportionment after the 2020 census, but still a comfortable lead. However, the 6 swing states that Biden won very narrowly paint a much more pessimistic picture for Biden. Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada are all tilting for Trump at this point. If those three went for Trump and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan stayed for Biden, we'd be at a 270 to 268 Biden victory. You might have noticed in the papers last week an effort in Nebraska to change from awarding electoral college votes by congressional district to doing a statewide allocation. That looks to have failed in the legislature now, but had it happened, that one Nebraska congressional district that voted for Biden would now be an electoral vote for Trump, and we would be at, drum roll, a 269 to 269 tie. So see again, indecision. But I wanted to just quickly tick off the individual state polling averages right now, and they're very favorable for Trump at the moment. Arizona, 4.5 points for Trump. Nevada, 3.2 for Trump. Georgia, 3.8 for Trump. Pennsylvania, 1/10 of a point for Biden. Michigan, 2.8 for Trump. Wisconsin, this average has it 0.6 for Trump, but my poll has it tied. And then North Carolina, which is a real reach for Democrats, but it was the closest state that Trump won, 4.6 for Trump. So if you go through that count, then the Electoral College is done. But I don't think that's the end game. We're six and a half months of campaigning left to do. We have issues like Arizona's abortion decision yesterday and Florida's abortion referendum. So there are important things going on, and oh yes, little things happening in the Middle East and with inflation today and unemployment and so on. So that's just sort of the big picture overview. I think the race is tightening, and I think there's a lot that happens between now and the conventions. In our January poll, we asked people if they thought Joe Biden would be the nominee. Would Donald Trump be the nominee? 30% of Republicans didn't think Biden would be, and 20% of Democrats didn't think Trump would be. So there's going to be a growing realization between now and the summer of who it is standing at the podium at the convention over there and down there, Chicago. So I think we will see a lot of partisans come home to their party over the spring and summer, and that'll affect the third party vote, which at the moment still looks really strong, but is unrealistically strong. Most polling shows the three third party candidates together getting 20% or more of the vote. But remember, in 2016, a recent high here, it was 5.5%. In 2020, it was 1.5%. You have to go back to Ross Perot for a third party candidate getting 19% of the vote. So I think those are things that are going to evolve over the course of the summer. But my new poll will be out next Wednesday, 12:15 at the law school. We'll give you a sandwich. I think we will see third parties remaining strong into the summer, and then some shifting as we get into the fall. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
And by your new poll,
I haven't quite used the whole 45
No, you didn't. By your new poll, you mean a look into Wisconsin, right?
Yes, a new Wisconsin poll out next Wednesday.
So let's talk about April 2nd. Help us read into why and what it means that 120,000 voters on the Republican side of the ticket said they did not want Donald Trump, Nikki Haley getting a majority of that, and why about 50,000 voters on the Democratic side voted uninstructed, with Dane County being almost double the percentage of the statewide, which was about 8%. What will you look for in your experience on watching Wisconsin politics? Where will those voters go? And in races decided by about 20,000, they need to get all of them.
Yep, and everybody can claim to be the pivotal vote with 20,000. Fun fact, though, Dane County was the worst county in the state for Biden, and the worst county in the state for Trump. So we're grumpy in Dane County, I'll tell you.
You got 25%.
Yeah, exactly. I think the first big takeaway for me is that there is still dissent in both parties. and maybe double the amount of dissent in the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party. Neither side can remotely dismiss 10 or 20% of their supporters as if that doesn't matter, or they're sure to come home, and also they're sure to vote, because not voting or skipping the top of the ticket is a real threat to both parties. What we saw all last year, both here in the state and nationally, was in the GOP, about 30% had an unfavorable view of Trump, about 70% were favorable. That 30% took all year to figure out that Haley was their last option. But you saw DeSantis sliding steadily all year. You saw her coming up slowly and then up at the end. But she's basically getting 80% of the don't like Trump vote, and then there's a little scattering elsewhere. Recently, we've seen Trump improve a bit with the GOP, getting up closer to 80% favorable, 20% unfavorable, and guess what he didn't get here? 21%. So I think those numbers line up pretty well. With Biden, it's that 10% or 11% that didn't vote for him. It was 8.3 uninstructed and whatever the rest was for Dean Phillips. That's another big threat for him, because it specifically goes to younger voters. And younger voters under 30, depending on how you want to define that, were a big, important element in both 2020 and 22 here in elections, with unusually high turnout from them. But this year, those folks are very disenchanted on the Democratic side. I don't want to get distracted, but I do want to give you one bit of numbers on this. The under 30s in our national polling, and the state usually looks very similar to this, are the most Democratic age group by far. They're the most liberal or very liberal group by far, and they have the lowest job approval of Joe Biden of any age group. They're unhappy about it, they're unenthusiastic about him and about voting. Now, most of that criticism is coming from the left, not from his right. And so will those folks abandon him and go over and vote for Donald Trump? That seems pretty unlikely. But not turning out, or not turning out at the levels that they did in 2020, is a big, big threat. So I think that's a major threat within the Democratic Party. With Trump, it's, again, in our polling, we're seeing in the latest poll about 12% of Republicans saying they'd vote for Biden, about 5 or 6% of Democrats saying they'd vote for Trump. However, a month ago, it was 6% Republicans crossing over, 7% Democrats crossing over. So that number's bouncing around a good bit. But there is a faction of the GOP that's disenchanted with Trump and have not been brought home. Look at Trump's latest comments on Robin Vos and the questions about the unity of the Republican Party here in the state when your presidential candidate is so committed to going after the speaker.
If I could just follow up quickly on that 25% in Dane, do you think some of those voters that I think we've seen across the country could have been Democratic Biden voters in 2020? And, you know, Nikki has appealed to some who don't want Biden or don't want Trump.
I don't want to dismiss that possibility out of hand, and obviously we didn't do a pre-primary poll, so I don't have a measure of that. But in previous primary years when we have polled, the crossover Democrats and the Republicans or Republicans in the Democratic primary, it's always stayed around 5% or so. So I don't think it's non-existent, but I don't think it's as big as sort of your armchair strategists who think, wouldn't it be great if all my people went over and voted on the other side?
I'd like to go back to enthusiasm. Looking at your most recent polling compared to certain similar points in time in the 2020 election, we're seeing a huge drop. How does this compare to other years beyond 2020? And also, can you drill down a little bit more into the two parties and independents as well?
Yeah. Here in Wisconsin, In January of 2020, 70% said they were very enthusiastic about voting. In January this year, 49% said they were very enthusiastic. Republicans are by far more enthusiastic. They are quite hepped up about this election. Democrats are the people that are much less enthusiastic, and I already mentioned younger voters. That's the perfect example of an important element of the Democratic coalition, but they're just not happy about it. And that has held up pretty well. That Trump has a significant lead in our January poll here among people who are very enthusiastic to vote. Biden has almost as big a lead among those somewhat enthusiastic, and those not very enthusiastic, and those not at all enthusiastic. And so, you know, you just need a march of the unenthusiastic to the polls. But, you know, it's obvious what a problem that poses to the party and the campaign. Is these are, as I mentioned, folks that are disapproving of Biden or disappointed with him. Israel and Gaza has certainly a lot to do with that, but it's not necessarily the only thing that's driving that. But it doesn't mean they like Donald Trump. That's going to be the real trick is, yeah, you think old Joe, but do you really want the other guy? And I think the campaign can be trusted to make that point to voters.
Are you seeing any indicators of which issues are driving that lack of enthusiasm, particularly in that younger group?
Yeah, the younger group really is quite pro-Palestinian compared to every other age cohort. You know, we always talk about age effects, and sometimes they're not as real as common wisdom thinks they are. But you look at our tables with the youngest group, they're the least pro-Israel, go up to the next age group more, the next age group more, and when you get up to the 65 and over, it is overwhelmingly pro-Israel. So there is a giant generational divide on Israel and Gaza in particular. We did ask in this most recent national if people think that Joe Biden is working for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And about 45% think that he is. About 25% think that he isn't, and 26% go, what? Which is also an important thing to realize, that if you go to your favorite college campus and talk about student protests in Israel and Gaza, you would think people are really, truly engaged on this issue. But across all of the age groups, 25% and up say they don't have an opinion about this question. And when you get to the youngest cohort, it's actually the biggest percentage that say they don't know what Biden's doing for a ceasefire, that say they don't know when it comes to aid to Israel in the war. And so I do think that it's easy to get caught up on the sort of activist core that, you know, understandably is getting a lot of attention. Showed up yesterday or Monday at the president's event in Madison. But let's not believe that that's a universal opinion of every 20-something. A lot of 20-somethings are busy doing other things with their lives.
Charles, as you're in the field ahead of next Wednesday, 538 ranks Marquette the third best poll in the country right now. So congratulations, just behind New York Times and Washington Post. Open up the hood for us.
I hate those guys.
Number one by November, right?
Yeah.
Open up the hood for us. I'm curious what changes you've made to the poll, especially this cycle as we look ahead to November, to maintain and ensure that accuracy. And how nervous are you the night before a poll comes out every Tuesday night?
The smart move would be to retire today and rest on the laurels, right? Because it can only get worse after November, I fear. We made a major change to our polling in 2023. From 2012, when we started the Marquette poll, to 2022, through the election, we did everything by live telephone interviews. Over that period, we migrated from about 15% cell phone to about 80% cell phone. And so that was one of the big moves over time. and we at the margins changed some of our procedures. And in 2022, our results were right at our average error. Over all the statewide polls we've done, our average error is 2.2 points off of the actual margin in the outcome. And so you see margin of error in polls, but that 2.2 average error is another way to think about it, of sort of how much are we on average off by. And happily, only like 0.4 of a point too Democratic. So the bias in the poll is very small compared to the 2.2 average error. But it just got unaffordably expensive. We've all talked about declining response rates over time. But by the time we got to the fall last year, fall of 2022, we were having to make many more dials in order to get our standard 800 completed responses. And all those dials come with an hourly wage connected to them. So it really was driving up our costs. We're also getting more concerned that young people, again, like my daughter, won't pick up her phone when someone calls, even if it's her father calling. Maybe especially if it's her father calling. So we thought it was time to change, and other pollsters have been making these changes too. We now are adopting what I think has become mostly the industry standard now, though there are still some holdout pollsters that are doing all telephone live interview things. So we do now a blended method. Most of our sample is from the registered voter list. In the past, we did random digit dialing. Now we're sampling from the registered voter list. The upside is you know everybody on that list is registered. In the modern era, you have a phone number and an email address for almost everybody on that list, and you at least have a phone number for everybody on the list. But what we do is we start by sending an email and a text message, each with a link that lets that one person log onto our website and answer the survey online rather than with a human. It has big pluses because they can do it whenever they want to, whenever it's convenient. The survey is formatted so it's very good looking on a phone or a tablet. And so there's really an upside there. And people seem to respond more quickly to those invitations than they did when we were trying to get them on the telephone. Now, after 2 or 3 days in the field, if we haven't heard from you, we will come looking for you, and we'll start calling your number. And so we still do roughly 20% by voice, by a human interviewer, but 20% of, now we're doing about 900 respondents per sample, is still a lot of a cost savings to us. But it does still allow us to reach people that maybe not online very much. We can still get them from the phone. Then there's another sample, another part of the sample, about 200 respondents each month, who were contacted at their home mailing address and invited to take part in polls over the coming year or so. The company that we contract with does all that. It's not me writing you a letter. But those folks have agreed in advance to do polls for a variety of subjects, and for each of our polls, we draw about 200 of them from Wisconsin into the sample. They are all interviewed online, and then we have the registered voter component that's about 700 or so that are mostly completed online, some by phone. The proof of the pudding, though, is on the upside, our results since we made the shift look very much in line with other high-quality national pollsters, including those doing work here in the state. But the ultimate answer is going to be next November, you know, and if I'm not hiding away in some undisclosed location, we'll know whether the new methodology gave us good results or not. Until then, it's just speculation with some reassuring indications, but we won't know for sure until after the election.
So you gave us some percentages on how what some of the averages are in the battleground states, and I think Wisconsin is the closest then at
With Pennsylvania.
With Pennsylvania,
Pennsylvania and
yeah.
Wisconsin are both very close.
So is it fair to say, going forward, given the margin of error, there will be no way to really see who is winning or leading on any given poll? And then the follow-up to that would also be, given how partisan we are in Wisconsin, is it easier for you, though, to ascertain where people stand when you're polling, because you know 49% are Republican and 49% are Democrat?
Yeah. You know, it's been a long time since I did a poll that was outside the margin of error. Maybe Baldwin in 18. We had her at 10.8, and she won by 11. But an average race, I mean, even the governor's race by 3 would have been barely inside the margin of error. And so I don't think, as a statistician, I'm all in favor of margin of error. But as helping you all to understand what our results are showing, it's only slightly helpful. Back when I was young and naive in 2012, I tried coming out and doing the results and saying, now that's inside the margin of error, this one's outside the margin of error. And it just became repetitive and useless, I thought, because close races are always inside the margin of error. And so if you say somebody is at 3 points ahead of someone else and the margin of error is 4, well, that's still a toss-up race. But you don't want to discount that somebody is 3 points ahead. And especially, I don't think you want to discount it when the last 4 polls have shown them at 3 points ahead, 4 points ahead, 2 points ahead. If there's consistency over that time, I'd feel pretty good about that. Or I did until Hillary Clinton was ahead in every poll in 2016. It didn't work out that way. So I think you always want to be cautious. You especially want to be cautious about an individual poll, especially if it looks like a big change from last time, because of the partisanship that we see. How many Trump voters really are going to cross over and vote for Joe Biden? How many Biden voters will really cross over and vote for Trump? That said, here in the state and nationally, we keep seeing between 10 and 12 or 14% initially saying they're undecided between Trump and Biden. When we then follow up and say, yes, but if you had to choose, who would you vote for? Then we get this near even tie most of the time, maybe plus 1 or 2 or dead even ties. So the safe takeaway is close-looking race. Maybe 12% could change their minds, that percent that's not giving a choice. I will say that early on in the survey, we always gave people the option to say undecided or don't know. Because as a political scientist, I think a lot of people don't live and breathe politics, and they genuinely don't know, and we want to represent that. But where it kind of came back to bite us is in 2016, when there was still a substantial fraction saying don't know between Clinton and Trump. The exit polls showed that those undecideds, late deciders, overwhelmingly broke for Trump. We'll never know, but what if I had pushed them with that, if you had to choose today, who would you vote for? And so it's that experience and the better empirical results, it seems, from pushing people to say, if you had to choose, who would you vote for? Let them break that tie or that undecided part. But it does mean that our results, like last month, we have it 49-49. That doesn't mean that only 2% are really kind of undecided. It means that we started with 12% that were undecided, and then we asked them to choose that came down, and just a couple of percent still said no. So that's a dicey thing. In the releases, I'm trying to include the if you had to choose result. That's my headline, that's my top line. We do that with the 2-party vote, and we do it with the 5-party vote. We also, just to make it more confusing, do registered voters and likely voters. But that very first question that allows you to say undecided in the two-party vote, I think is still worth paying attention to, and I'm trying again to keep that in the first several paragraphs of each story.
So here's a big picture question. Pollsters have gotten plenty of criticism, particularly since 2016. Journalists also get a lot of criticism on how we cover polls, whether it's too much focus on the horse race, whether we just pay too much attention to them in general. What is your hope when you are polling? What is your hope that the public does with this information?
Sure, love. I actually have a serious answer to this. I, like everybody, loves a good horse race. And I do think that knowing where the horse race is and how it's moved is a useful thing to do. But the story I've been trying to repeat for the last, since the day after the 2022 election, is the old story of pollsters, we all say it's just a snapshot in time. It's true. But what happens when you take a snapshot and then another and another and another, and you string them together and you run them? You got a movie. You see how things changed over time. And I think this year, especially through the primaries to this point, I see the real value here of, a lot of people are saying, how did we get Donald Trump and Joe Biden? Well, I've got 18 months, nearly 24 months of polling now that shows you how those races changed over time. Each individual snapshot was worth knowing that Biden's at this, Trump's at this, DeSantis is at that, Haley's at that. But when you string them together, you see that at the beginning of 2023, in a head-to-head, Ron DeSantis was a little ahead of Donald Trump among Republican voters. That's only head-to-head without any other candidates. You saw that DeSantis was nearly as well liked among Republicans as Trump was, and that in fact, in January of 23, DeSantis was winning 43% of Republicans who themselves were favorable to Donald Trump. That was a real threat from within the Trump base for DeSantis to make progress. And Nikki Haley was down at 2 or 3%. But then in every poll in 2023 and now into 2024, DeSantis fell and fell and fell and fell. There was not a single month when he went up with Republican voters. Haley didn't really start to move until the August debate across the street. But then she rose, not to stratospheric levels, but rose steadily past DeSantis. And then when he dropped out, she became the last player. So to my mind, that motion picture of what happened is a great explanation of how the party initially considered an alternative to Trump. But whether it was because of DeSantis's failures or Trump's strengths, turned away from that possibility. And the person they did consider in the end, Haley, just could never bring any of those Trump favorable voters over to her the way DeSantis was doing in January of 2023. So that's my wish, that we all had enough time and leisure to do that kind of story. But I do think it's a very valuable look at how the race has changed and how did we get here. I'm repeating a lot of questions every time, and it may be that none of them change, but I want us to be able to look in that late October poll release and say, okay, how did we get here? What has shaped up in the state across the year that's either notable for changing or perhaps notable that, nope, nobody moved on any of this. So that's my hope.
You mentioned you poll registered and likely voters. I have people tell me, ignore any poll that looks at registered voters. It is junk. Only look at likely voters. I'm curious your take. And
yeah, their party must be ahead with likely voters. Yeah, I would have a vigorous debate over beer and pretzels with those people in a wholly professional way. So in the state polling, we only interview registered voters, some of whom are likely voters, right? We do not do interviews in the state with adults who are not registered to vote. We're a high registration state to begin with, If you're still not registered, well, if you're young, you may very well register late. And if you're mobilized, there'll be some of that. But that's a decision that we have a finite amount of money to spend on interviews. I want to spend it on people who at least could wake up on Tuesday morning and go vote. Nationally, we do include unregistered, and I'll have a word to say about that in a second. My take on it, and this differs across pollsters and across campaign officials, I think likelihood of voting is more a psychological attribute that can change over the course of the campaign, and especially asking somebody today, how likely are you to vote, which I am asking them today, but I don't think their answer to that is a terribly great indicator of what they would say if we interviewed them in October. And so, whereas registration is much stickier, granted it can change, but it's a lot stickier. And so I focus on the registered voters through the year and shift to emphasizing likelies in the summer and fall. Because of the demand for likely voter results, I have already started including in the release the likely voter results. But I just don't emphasize it so much because I don't think it's predictive. Campaign pollsters and some of my brethren in the other nonpartisan polling look at the voter file and see, okay, this is someone that's voted in 9 of the last 9 elections. That's a likely voter. And that's not going to change this year. And then there's a debate about how many of the last however many elections do you have to have voted in to be considered likely. But those folks are taking this more as a behavioral measure of how often you voted recently, whereas I'm relying on the question, how likely is it you will vote this fall? Are you absolutely certain, likely, and so on? So that's a legitimate debate. Sometimes you'll see differences in the likely and the registered. So for us, the case in point, the actual numbers, in our, make sure I'm reading this right, yes. In our March national poll, we have it 50-50 between Biden and Trump with registered voters. With likely voters, Biden's at 52, Trump's at 48. So Trump goes down 2 and Biden goes up 2 when you switch to likely voters. But here's the interesting side note. In that same national poll, I can divide people into people registered and certain they're going to vote, likely voters. That's the 52-48. What about people who are registered but say they're less than certain they're going to vote? So likely, maybe will, may not. Biden 44, Trump 56. And among the adults who are not registered to vote, Biden 36, Trump 64. That is, and I should say, I've gone back and looked at that over the previous 3 national polls. The numbers bounce around a little bit, but the direction is the same across all 3 national polls, and when you pool them all together. So that really is an interesting question. You know, high turnout was supposed to favor the Democrats. Big voter registration drives that don't pay any attention to who you are, just everybody get registered. It's good for democracy. Yeah, but if you do that believing these numbers, you'd be registering an awful lot of potential Trump voters who aren't previously registered, or motivating those who are registered but not as likely to vote. Again, those things can change over time. I'm not saying this is baked in, but it has been steady since in the November, January, and March polls.
I think we just got a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you, you've been polling since 2012?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say you have polled on the issue of abortion more than any other issue?
Probably, aside from things like job approval numbers. I think we've asked the abortion question 16 times over that period. Maybe it's a little bit more.
So my question for you is, because it looks like it could be an important, the deciding issue in this campaign, but the language around it has changed as well. We hear now the term more reproductive rights. So how are you polling on this issue, and what have you seen where I guess prior Republicans were seeing it as, you know, something that helped them with voters, and now are seeing it where it could hurt them with voters?
So on the question wording thing, we've used one question that we've asked all these times that uses a pretty standard question that a lot of national pollsters use as well. So it's good you can make the comparison. And it's not great. It is, do you think abortion should be legal in all circumstances, in most circumstances, illegal in most circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances? And especially with those two middle categories, you'd certainly be free to shrug and go, I'm not sure what this means. But the results have been quite stable since 2012 when we first started asking it, with something between 60 and 65% saying legal in all or most, something in the 35 to maybe 40% range saying illegal in all or most. Since the Dobbs decision, the main change is a little rise in the legal in all or most, getting up pushing 70% instead of the mid-60s. And a noticeable drop from about 12 or a little more saying illegal in all circumstances to now only about 6% saying illegal in all. And I don't think you'd stretch the imagination to see our circumstances post-Dobbs as making that issue more prevalent than it had been pre-Dobbs. We also, though, introduced new questions. And there's always a tension. I want that long time series so I can answer the question like I just did. How much has it changed over time? And you can't do that if you're asking different questions. But we are now asking about a 14-week ban when that came up in the legislature recently. We've asked about a 15-week ban because that's the Lindsey Graham kind of point that's been asked about. We've asked that question quite a few times. We also ask about medication abortions and whether they're available through the mail or not. We ask about restrictions on interstate travel for abortion services. So the language is always, I'm trying to catch the language that's in common usage, not necessarily what the interest groups use, but I don't necessarily avoid that. We've never asked, are you pro-life or pro-choice? But if we had, I would have used pro-life and pro-choice because that's what the sides identified as the sort of position.
We've got a Senate race on the ballot also. At what point in the race going forward do you feel that voters have enough information and you have enough information for us to look at the poll and get a sense of where things really are?
Wednesday. In our January poll, Hovde had not yet declared, but I did include him on the favorable, unfavorable list. And of course, we asked Baldwin every time on favorability, just like we asked Johnson every time on favorability. Baldwin has been running 3 or 4 points net negative lately. Maybe it's 2 to 4 points. It's not much negative. But it is down a little bit from where she was in 2022 when she was 3 or 4 points net positive. If you put a chart of Baldwin's favorability numbers over time since 2012, it is stunning how stable it's been. A little above even, a little below even, but never taking a long plunge down. Whereas Ron Johnson has seen both highs and lows, much more variability than Baldwin has. With Hovde, we actually do have 2012 polling on him from his Senate race then. But in the recent polling in June and then in January, he was at about a little over 80% saying they didn't know enough to have an opinion of him. That's hardly surprising given that he's been out of the public eye so long. And his advertising campaign and everything will change that over time. But it's still a massive level of don't know. There are only 2 polls, public polls, that I'm aware of in the state that show it either a 6-point or a 3-point Baldwin lead. But there's no more information I have about that other than just that simple horse race. And that's where the polarization comes in. Even not knowing much about one of the candidates, partisans are going to line up when your question says, will you vote for Democrat Tammy Baldwin or Republican Eric Hovde? So that's all the information some people might have about Hovde, but it might be all the information they need to line themselves up, even if a couple of questions earlier they said, I don't know that name. So I expect to see a close race, but if you go back to 2018 or the 2022 primaries, state primaries, Tony Evers was way over 50% didn't know him in the spring, and it stayed in the 40s right up to the primary day. If you look at the Republican gubernatorial primary or the Senate Democratic primary before it blew up at the end, those candidates were also very little known throughout the spring and summer. And so one of the repetitive aspects was, okay, they've got slightly more favorable than unfavorable, but still half of the people, or 60%, don't know them. I'll expect to see that to be true of Hovde for a while, but I think that's utterly normal for candidates that aren't universally known.
I think we have about 30 seconds. From what you're seeing at this moment, we're going to run it like Sunday. At this point, I mean, how much do voters really hate this thought of the Trump-Biden rematch?
Good bit. 19% are saying they are unfavorable to both Biden and Trump in our latest polls. In 2016, it was running 28%, though it did come down to the mid to low 20s close to Election Day. And in 2020, it was only about 12% unfavorable to both Biden and Trump. So it's more unfavorable than 20, less unfavorable than at a similar period in 2016. Some of that could go away as people come home to their party. That 21% of Republicans and 11% of Democrats probably are going to decide that they actually like one better than the other by sometime over the summer. So we might actually see those double haters come down. Being Midwest nice, my publications call them double negative voters, not haters. That's an East Coast phrase to call them haters. Okay?
Okay, I'd like to thank our panel of journalists for their questions. Now it's your turn. So if you have a question, please stand up and identify yourself would be nice and ask your question. Go ahead.
Sorry, Mayor, we do a poll as well, a couple of them coming up. I'm interested in a comment about the 49% enthusiasm. Is everyone saying enthusiasm and apathy? So, if you ask people if they're excited about the Super Bowl right now, they're going to say no, it's not even on my mind. Yeah. Are you historically, from previous elections, is that number going to ramp way up in October to the point where people are very enthusiastic? Because 9% people register to vote. They might not be enthusiastic about voting, but they're going, what have you seen historically?
No, I think that's a good point. Historically, certainly enthusiasm rises over the course of the year. So that it's 49 today doesn't mean it'll be 49 the day before the election. The comparison I made between January of 2020, when it was 70%, and the 49 this January, I think is a more telling comparison of this year versus a comparable point in an earlier election. I do think that what we're seeing largely on the Democratic side is, for a variety of reasons, disappointment with Biden. We've talked about Israel. That is an element, but especially so with younger voters. But I don't think you want to discount disappointment about the economy. And yes, there's a big argument about what the real economy is versus how people see the economy. But in the end, there's no denying that there are significant, not a huge number, but a significant number of Democrats that aren't thrilled with how the economy is going right now. And that normally hurts an incumbent president. So I do think that's part of it. Back to that thing of polarization, though. Does that mean they're so unenthusiastic that they'd really stay home or really would vote for the other party? Trump in that case, but we do have the Haley voters on the counter case. So I'm going to watch it. Enthusiasm is not a super strong predictor of actual turnout, whereas the answer to my question about how certain you are to vote is a very strong predictor of actual turnout, verified against the voter list. And so that's, again, why I think the attitude of being certain to vote is independent or partially independent of enthusiasm, but surely unenthusiastic voters are less likely in the end to vote. So change their enthusiasm or not.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm Megan Omaz with ProPublica. Can you talk about the black vote here in Wisconsin and
Sure.
also nationally?
Yeah, I can. There are two problems in talking about it that I think you have to appreciate at the beginning. Black registered voters only make up about 4 or 5% of the state registered voters. And as a result, we have a terrible time in any sample having enough people in that category. Not because we're undersampling them, but simply because there are not very many in the population. The same applies to Hispanic voters here. So the way we normally do this is we pull all the polls over the course of a year, 6 or 8 polls, to build up a large enough sample size to have confidence in what we're saying about black or Hispanic voters. But it's still a much smaller group with a much bigger standard error. So I want to get that out there. In our national polling, we have a better foundation because nationally the black population is about 14%, so we have a considerably bigger sample size in each poll. Okay, so that's the sort of technical, nerdy stuff. In terms of actual votes here in Milwaukee, in the wards that are majority black, I'm talking aldermanic wards here, not precincts. In the aldermanic wards that are majority black, Biden's vote dropped 2 to 3 points below what Clinton got in those same wards in 2016. But in Hispanic wards, Biden got 7 or 8% less than Clinton had gotten. So that modest drop-off in black vote and more noticeable drop-off in Hispanic vote, again, based on the votes, not based on the survey, is very much in line with what Catalyst, the big data analytics firm, produced looking back as what the drop-off was. So I think those are important benchmarks for us. As for our actual surveys, what we're seeing is black approval of Biden running in the 60% range. People look at that and say, oh my God, that's terrible for him. But on the other hand, white approval is 30%, 35%. So you're certainly seeing a difference. It's just far from unanimous. On the vote questions, you're getting substantial majorities of blacks saying they would vote for Biden rather than Trump. Hispanic voters are more evenly divided with a bit of a tilt towards Biden, but certainly not a big one. But we're still 6 months away from the election. So the things we were saying earlier about people coming home to their parties applies to black and Hispanic voters as well. And I think some of the claims that there's a big realignment taking place are not to be dismissed. But it'd sure be more useful if we were comparing where those alignments stand today with where they stood in April in 2020 and April in 2016. And most of the analysis I see compares where we are today with what the exit polls showed on election night or with the latest big good polls just before election day. And so I think there's an apples to oranges comparison there that's being potentially a little misleading. All of that said, I think you look at the actual voting data, certainly for majority Hispanic areas in South Florida, all along the Texas border, but often overlooked in LA County and in New Jersey. And I think there's clear evidence there for some erosion of Democratic support in 2020. And smaller, considerably smaller erosion in black support. Again, the Catalyst analytics deep dive on the 2020 election is, along with Pew's post-election analysis, the best things I know of to look at for those.
Next question. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Is there any insight to be gained by looking at the referendum questions from the statewide level on constitutional amendments?
Yeah.
Or is that kind of an apples to oranges?
So again, we didn't do any pre-election polling on this. I would be really surprised if most voters didn't find those referenda on their ballot and that was all they knew about it before they cast their vote. The more engaged certainly saw opinion leaders saying vote yes or vote no on these things. You know, and the wording was not dramatic, presumably deliberately so. And so I wasn't really surprised that they passed. But compared to issues that become sort of center of attention that you'd see in a presidential or a Senate race or maybe in a House race, I think they're flying pretty low under the radar. You could go back to our Defense of Marriage amendments in the mid-2000s as examples of referenda that were getting more attention ahead of time and where it was a little more clear that this was a political position you were taking when you read the amendment's language, and those passed. But I think the reason for these is very clear within a certain segment of the Republican Party and represent real concerns that have been an issue since the 2020 election. But I think for the vast majority of voters, they just aren't highly salient. And again, the minimal campaign around them and the wording of them makes me not take them terribly seriously. I'd also point to one other thing. Think about all of the abortion referenda around the country since 2022, since Dobbs, and they've all passed when that was the only issue on that ballot. And they did that in red states and blue states and purple states. But at the same time, in Georgia, a Republican governor who signed very restrictive anti-abortion laws got reelected overwhelmingly. In Ohio, the same story. And so when you're talking about referenda that deal with a single issue and it's salient, you can get a real clear signal. But when it's about candidates who have an abortion issue but also have a variety of other things about them, then it still, I think, is a potent issue, but it's not the single overwhelming issue it is with a referenda. If we had had an abortion referendum on the ballot where it was really clear what you were voting for, I would give much more credence to what signal that sends. I just don't think these were clear enough or strong enough to read a lot into.
Any other questions? Well, we're asking the five-party vote now. We've been asking it for several polls, so we are monitoring that with Kennedy, West, and Stein on the ballot. We obviously don't know for sure who's going to qualify for the ballot in the end, so that's a side issue. In our state polls and our national polls, those three together are running up around 20% total support. If you look here in Wisconsin, I mentioned earlier that 2016 it was 5.5% voted for any of the third-party candidates. In 2020 it was only 1.5%. If we go back to 2000, that great election that almost made us the hanging Chad state, it was 5.3%, I want to say, and dropped down to 1% or less in 2004. I think an interesting question is, it certainly looks like super close elections with a high third-party vote are followed by elections with a much lower third-party vote. The sort of, oh my God, I voted third party and then my least preferred candidate won. I guess this does matter. Maybe there is a dime's worth of difference. And you see that in 2000 to 2004. You see it again in 16 to 20. I don't want to make too much over 4 examples, but I think they're useful examples. But 2016 was 8 years ago, and if you're 22 years old, 8 years ago was a lifetime. So I am curious whether we'll see a sort of reluctance to go third party this fall, or as the current data are showing, a shockingly high percentage going third party. Remember Ross Perot in 1992 got 19% nationally. I
I think it was 21% here, but anyway, it was a little more than 19. But that's just really exceptional going back over the years. John Anderson got like 8% in his third-party run.
Okay, one last question, if there is one.
David Bone with ARP. I have a question about misinformation.
Yeah.
In elections and what you're asking voters about where they trust their information.
Just say that again. Who they trust for information?
What sources do they trust
Yeah.
for information?
Yeah, that's a good subject that I have not delved into. If anybody's interested in it, I would check out the media people at UW-Madison, Mike Wagner in particular and Devon Shaw. They are doing magnificent work on the media environment in Wisconsin. I don't know specifically if they've looked at this question, but I'd bet they have. And those are fantastic researchers who've just done a ton of work here. We have sometimes asked who you get your news from, and it lines up just the way you think it is. You know, Fox is the top, but the three broadcast networks are bigger together than Fox is. MSNBC is a ways down. Public radio and public television are quite high, relatively speaking. And local news, I should say. Local news is really the standout.
Thanks for that.
You can pay me later. But local news really is a trusted source for a lot of people. You kind of wonder, you know, that's fine. What about things other than your state or your city? Anyway, the trouble with all of that analysis is people chose to watch Fox or chose to watch MSNBC. And so saying that you believe X because you watched Fox, no, you believed X and you watched Fox is not necessarily a correlation there. And that takes really expensive scientific study that a few academic institutions do, but I don't do. We do ask some things that fall in this category. We have asked since 2020 whether you're confident that the ballots were actually cast and counted. There's been minuscule movement in that over these last 4 years. It's 65% say they were accurately done, 35% say not. But among Republicans, it's the other way around. It's 65 that doubt that they were accurate, 35% think they were. Democrats, 90% think they were. How much of that is the information environment? How much of it is false information? How of it is old-fashioned partisanship, that we believe what our party leaders tell us? Anyway, that's not a satisfactory answer, but go call Mike Wagner. He'll help.
Another thank you to
Thank you much.
And because he had that nice shout out for local news, I want to present him with this collector's edition of the Milwaukee Press Club hat, and all of you can purchase one. Just see Joette, $20, and the proceeds go to our endowment, which helps student journalists, so you're helping the future. So if you believe in journalism, buy a hat. Here you go.
I'm so thrilled. I collect hats, and this is one that I genuinely will wear in pride.
That's right. All right. Thank you very much. See? All right, thank you very much. Just a couple of things. We want to thank our event sponsors and the Newsroom Pub and the Safe House for being the hosting sponsor of this event. If you are not a member of the Press Club and you'd like to be, and you should be, see Joette or go to our website, MilwaukeePressClub.org. There's all sorts of information there for you. Some very important events coming up tomorrow. That's April 11th. In the evening, we have a special Newsmakers at Night celebrating two Milwaukee artists, Mike Brophy and Mike DeSisti. Mike DeSisti is still a photojournalist at the journal Sentinel, but he's a fabulous artist as well. So it could be a fun evening, and if you're interested and you have not registered yet, again, you can still do that, or you can see Joette back there. May 3rd is our big Gridiron Awards dinner, where we will be honoring local news and statewide journalists. So that's at the Pfister Hotel. That's May 3rd. And Wednesday, May 29th, Gwen Moore will be here for a Newsmaker Luncheon. And that's all I have. So thank you again for being here. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the nice weather.